Now to the war in Ukraine, that country facing one of the most crucial and difficult periods since Russia invaded more than 4 months ago. As Russia continues to assault civilian areas with rockets and missiles, the latest strike overnight hit a residential building and a recreation center near the port city of Odessa, killing at least 19 people and injuring 31 others. Ukrainian officials say 2 children are among the dead. One Ukrainian general said Russia has more than doubled the rate of its missile strikes in the last 2 weeks. He said many of the Russian munitions being used in the attacks date back to the Soviet era and lack accuracy, resulting in high civilian casualties. The human rights organization Amnesty International, meanwhile, says Russia committed a war crime when it bombed a theater in Mariupol in March. Hundreds of civilians were sheltering in that theater, you'll remember, when Russia attacked it during a siege of the southern Ukrainian port city that Russian troops now occupy. That strike killed at least a dozen people, likely many more. Amnesty International says Russia blocked its crisis response team from entering the city after that attack. Russia has denied carrying out the attack. Amnesty says Russia did not respond to letters summarizing evidence it had gathered and seeking information about potential criminal investigations. Let's bring in former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He also is Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Admiral, great to have you with us this morning. What's your read on these stepped-up attacks, clearly from Russia, deeper inside to Ukraine, going after civilian targets, trying to spin them as, the mall was actually a weapons depot. It was closed at the time. That's plainly untrue because of the dead that are still being counted in that mall. What are they doing here other than showing we can still do this to you?
They are showing us that Russia is a terrorist state. They are attacking civilian population centers. And it's clear that it's a part of the strategy that Vladimir Putin has undertaken, which is to terrorize the civilian population. In some dark corner of his twisted mind, he must think that if he scares the people of Ukraine enough, they'll back down. They're not going to. This is yet another stack of lies from Vladimir Putin when he says that's not part of their strategy. It's endless, these attacks. And it needs to be addressed on a kind of a separate track, Willie, from the military operations, the diplomatic operations, the economic operations. We ought to have a track for addressing these war crimes. International Criminal Court, bring the indictments, and bring the indictments against the generals down to the sergeants, and from the generals up to Vladimir Putin.
And, you know, no conscience about it. Obviously, it was just about 3 days ago he attacks a mall, and then today in Odessa he's attacking a residential building and killing children. How much of this, Admiral, in your eyes, is about what was going on west of Odessa, what was going on in NATO, in Madrid, what was going on with the G7, which is that alliance was being strengthened. There was a commitment to more military spending, the forward deployment, all the way up now with Finland on Russia's border. That this is not going well for Vladimir Putin? Was he counter-programming? Was he sending a message? What do you think he was up to there?
Oh, I think that's definitely part of it. He needs to be able to turn to his military and say, we're not losing this thing, except, in fact, they are. Their object was to take over the entire country, to put a puppet regime. President Putin probably promised President Xi a 3 or 4 day war. He's got a 5 to 6 month debacle on his hands. And therefore, Putin is, when he sees Finland and Sweden joining NATO, he sees the Germans doubling their defense budget. He sees the unity of the West economically and continuing to impose these sanctions. He feels he's in the category of, I've got to do something. And all he can do is lash out against the civilian population because his forces are effectively bogged down in the center of Ukraine. Putin has a bad hand of cards, and it's not going to get any better.
You were the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. You have a better view of that alliance than just about anybody in the United States. What did you make of everything you saw over the last couple of days, of the unity, the expansion, and everything else really historic that we saw in Madrid?
Willie, if we're allowed to have some good news for once, this is it. And the expansion of NATO with the joining of Sweden and Finland, you've heard me say it before, these are high-tech, highly capable countries. That long border complicates Putin's military planning immensely. These are two turnkey militaries joining the alliance. They're ready to go. They've operated with us. They've fought with us in Afghanistan and Libya. Huge plus up. When you add that to the defense budget increases going on across the alliance and the unified tone, and then finally, Willie, the issuance of a new strategic plan, first time in a decade, clearly lays Russia at the top of the stack of threats. This has been an exceptionally good week for NATO, and kudos to the president for pulling off the Finland-Sweden joining NATO. I felt his personal diplomacy was a big part of that.
And as President Biden said yesterday in Madrid, Vladimir Putin's getting exactly the opposite of what he hoped for in terms of NATO when he started this war. Admiral, I want to get your take on this story. WNBA star Brittney Griner arrived this morning in a Russian court for the start of her trial on drug charges. She's been in custody for 4 months now. Many experts believe she is all but certain to be convicted. NBC's senior international correspondent Keir Simmons has details.
In a Moscow courtroom this morning, appearing for the first day of her trial, WNBA superstar Brittney Griner. Griner was arrested at a Russian airport in February, accused of carrying vape cartridges that contained cannabis oil in her luggage. The charge, large-scale transportation of drugs. If convicted, she could face a decade in a Russian prison, and Griner has to remain in custody for the entire criminal trial. Griner's wife, Cheryl, says the two-time Olympic gold medalist is struggling and terrified.
And I told her, I said, I saw a picture, and honestly, for a second, I thought you was insane. And so I told her, I was like, I just want to tell you one thing. I said, if you are losing your mind, just be gracious with yourself because you're human, and that's okay.
Griner's detainment comes amid Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine and strained diplomatic relations with the United States. The State Department saying Griner is being wrongfully detained, and we have no higher priority than the safety and security of US citizens overseas. In June, I asked President Putin's spokesman about her arrest.
She was coming to take part in sport in Russia, effectively trying to build bridges through sport. It's a terrible message, isn't it, that she should be arrested?
It is also a terrible message to bring some forbidden essences and materials to this country, and it is prosecuted by Russian laws.
The Kremlin is not commenting on Russian media reports that it hopes to exchange Griner for an arms trafficker jailed in the US, denying that she is effectively a hostage.
NBC's Keir Simmons reporting. Admiral, it is maddening to see such a bright American star in handcuffs there for having some residue in her luggage. And we're getting reporting from the New York Times this morning that the Kremlin is sending signals to the Biden White House that we'll let her go if you release this international arms dealer called the Merchant of Death from an American prison, as if there's some equivalence in those two crimes. How does this play out, Admiral Stavridis? How does the United States, how does the Biden administration get Brittney Griner home?
Point one, the administration is correct to say we have hostages that are held all around the world, unfortunately, and we need to address all of them with equal alacrity. This particular case, Willie, appears even unusually trumped up for a Russia that, as I said earlier, is built these days on a stack of lie after lie after lie. And then thirdly, the point that Keir made, here is a woman, a fine athlete, going over there, as he said, to build bridges, participate in international sport. Boy, in my view, every international athletic association ought to begin by simply dropping Russia. Some of them have. Some other events are still allowing the Russians to participate, saying, oh, sport rises above politics. Well, evidently it doesn't in Moscow. She is being used as a bargaining chip. We ought to step into this, lean into this, and find every means to put pressure on the Putin administration.
And as I said, unless something changed, she could be convicted of this crime and put in prison for a decade. A retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis, thanks so much for being with us, and enjoy the 4th of July weekend, sir. Good to see you.
You as well.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, an historic moment for the Supreme Court as Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson officially is sworn in. That moment wrapping up one of the most consequential terms for the court ever. And later this hour, we will dig into new reporting that Trump allies might be trying to influence witness testimony in the January 6 investigation. What that means for the probe's next steps when Morning Joe returns on a Friday morning.